Chapter 7. The District Officer's Narrow Escape. Some little time before the flight of the workmen, I had written to Mr. Whitehead, the District Officer, asking him to come up and assist me in my campaign against the lions, and to bring with him any of his Ascaris, native soldiers, that he could spare. He replied, accepting the invitation, and told me to expect him about dinner time on December 2nd, which turned out to be the day after the exodus. His train was due at Tsavo about 6 o'clock in the evening, so I sent my boy up to the station to meet him and to help in carrying his baggage to the camp. In a very short time, however, the boy rushed back trembling with terror, and informed me that there was no sign of the train or of the railway staff, but that an enormous lion was standing on the station platform. This extraordinary story I did not believe in the least, as by this time the coolies, never remarkable for bravery, were in such a state of fright that if they caught sight of a hyena or a baboon, or even a dog, in the brush, they were sure to imagine it was a lion. But I found out next day that it was an actual fact, and that both station master and signalmen had been obliged to take refuge from one of the man-eaters by locking themselves in the station building. I waited some little time for Mr. Whitehead, but eventually, as he did not put in an appearance, I concluded that he must have postponed his journey until the next day, and so had my dinner in my customary solitary state. During the meal I heard a couple of shots, but paid no attention to them, as rifles were constantly being fired off in the neighborhood of the camp. Later in the evening I went out as usual to watch for our elusive foes, and took up my position in a crib made of sleepers, which I had built on a bigger girder close to a camp which I thought was likely to be attacked. Soon after settling down at my post, I was surprised to hear the man-eaters growling and purring and crunching of bones about 70 yards from my crib. I could not understand what they had found to eat, as I had heard no commotion in the camps, and I knew by bitter experience that every meal the brutes obtained from us was announced by shrieks and uproar. The only conclusion I could come to was that they had pounced upon some poor unsuspecting native traveler. After a time I was able to make out their eyes glowing in the darkness, and I took as careful aim as was possible in the circumstances and fired. But the only notice they paid to the shot was to carry off whatever was being devoured and retire quietly over a slight rise, which prevented me from seeing them. There they finished their meal at their ease. As soon as it was daylight, I got out of my crib and went towards the place where I had last heard them. On the way, whom should I meet but my missing guest, Mr. Whitehead, looking very pale and ill, and generally disheveled. "Where on earth have you come from?" I exclaimed. "Why didn't you turn up to dinner last night?" "A nice reception you give a fellow when you invite him to dinner," was his only reply. "Why, what's up?" I asked. "That infernal lion of yours nearly did for me last night," said Whitehead. "Nonsense, you must have dreamed it," I cried in astonishment. For answer he turned round and showed me his back. "That's not much of a dream, is it?" he asked. His clothing was rent by one huge tear from the nape of the neck downwards, and on the flesh there were 4 great claw marks showing red and angry through the torn cloth. Without further parley, I hurried him off to my tent, and bathed and dressed his wounds, and when I had made him considerably more comfortable, I got from him the whole story of the events of the night. It appeared that his train was very late, so that it was quite dark when he arrived at Tsavo station, from which the track to my camp lay through a small cutting. He was accompanied by Abdullah, his sergeant of Ascaris, who walked close behind him carrying a lighted lamp. All went well until they were about halfway through the gloomy cuttings, when one of the lions suddenly jumped down upon them from the high bank, knocking Whitehead over like a ninepin, and turning his back in the manner I had seen. Fortunately, however, he had his carbine with him, and instantly fired. The flash and the loud report must have dazed the lion for a second or two, enabling Whitehead to disengage himself, but the next instant the brute pouncing like lightning on the unfortunate Abdullah, with whom he at once made off. All that poor fellow could say was, "Eh, Bawana Simba," means, "Oh, master, a lion." As the lion was dragging him over the bank, Whitehead fired again, but without effect, and the brute quickly disappeared in the darkness with his prey. It was, of course, this unfortunate man whom I had heard the lions devouring during the night. Whitehead himself had a marvelous escape. His wounds were happily not very deep, and caused him little to no inconvenience afterwards. On the same day, December 3rd, the forces arrayed against the lions were further strengthened. Mr. Farquhar, the superintendent of police, arrived from the coast with a score of sepoys to assist in hunting down the man-eaters, whose fame had by this time spread far and wide, and the most elaborate precautions were taken, his men being posted on the most convenient trees near every camp. Several other officials had also come up on leave to join in the chase, and each of these guarded a likely spot in the same way, Mr. Whitehead sharing my post inside the crib on the girder. Further, in spite of some chaff, my lion trap was put in a thorough working order, and 2 of the sepoys were installed as bait. Our preparations were quite complete by nightfall, and we all took up our appointed positions. Nothing happened till about 9 o'clock, when to my great satisfaction the intense stillness was suddenly broken by the noise of the door of the trap clattering down. "At last," I thought. "One at least of the brutes is done for." But the sequel was an ignominious one. The bait sepoys had a lamp burning inside their part of the cage, and were each armed with a Martini rifle, with plenty of ammunition. They had also been given strict orders to shoot at once if a lion should enter the trap. Instead of doing so, however, they were so terrified when he rushed in and began to lash himself madly against the bars of the cage, that they completely lost their heads, and were actually too unnerved to fire. Not for some minutes. Not, indeed, until Mr. Farquhar, whose post was close by, shouted at them and cheered them on, did they at all recover themselves. Then when at last they did begin to fire, they fired with a vengeance. Anywhere, anyhow. Whitehead and I were at right angles to the direction in which they should have shot. Yet their bullets came whizzing all around us. Altogether they fired over a score of shots, and in the end succeeded only in blowing away one of the bars of the door, thus allowing our prize to make good his escape. How they failed to kill him several times over is, and always will be, a complete mystery to me, as they could have put the muzzles of their rifles absolutely touching his body. There was indeed some blood splatter about the trap, but it was small consolation to know that the brute, whose capture and death seemed so certain, had only been slightly wounded. Still we were not unduly dejected, and when morning came, a hunt was at once arranged. Accordingly, we spent the greater part of the day on our hands and knees, following the lines through the dense thickets of thorny jungle. But though we heard their growls from time to time, we never succeeded in actually coming up on them. Of the whole party, only Farquhar managed to catch a momentary glimpse of one as it bounded over a bush. 2 days more were spent in the same manner, and with equal unsuccess, and then Farquhar and his sepoys were obliged to return to the coast. Mr. Whitehead also departed for his district, and once again I was left alone with the man-eaters.